All right, so today we're talking about
Lyndon
Dwight
Johnson.
Eisenhower's presidency. So when we talked about Kennedy, I said that I have a bias against Kennedy and that I don't really like Kennedy all that much. With Johnson, I also have a bias. With Johnson, I like him a whole lot. So if I say really nice things about Johnson, feel free to ignore it. Feel free to believe that I'm exaggerating or whatever you want. But just know that that bias exists before we go into this. All right, Johnson becomes president in November of 1963, right after Kennedy is shot and killed. And once Johnson becomes president, he is going to start pushing for his domestic policy called the Great Society. So essentially, Johnson calls all of his advisors together and he says, what problems exist in America today and how can we fix them? And so he's going to, with his advisors, come up with these 5 platforms that he's going to focus on. This is fairly unusual for a president. Most presidents are going to pick 1 or maybe 2 things to focus on. So like George W. Bush was the education president, Barack Obama picked healthcare. You focus on 1 or 2 things because if you pick a wide range of things and you don't succeed, people are going to say you failed, even if you got 3 out of the 5. So for Johnson to push for these 5 is pretty impressive. So the 5 parts of the Great Society are going to be beautification and urbanization, civil rights, the war on poverty, education, and healthcare. If Johnson ends up being successful in any of those, that's a huge deal. But the fact that he's going to push in all of them is pretty impressive. One thing that's interesting about Johnson is that as soon as he's president, within 12 months, we are going to have an election. So he immediately has to start thinking about campaigning and about winning this election. In 1964, the Republican candidate is going to be Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater is pretty hawkish, very pro-war. Johnson is going to run something called the Daisy Ad, which is designed to compare his perspective to Goldwater's. When you guys watch the Daisy Ad, I want you to pay attention to the contrast between the Daisy Ad and the ads I've shown you already. And I want you guys to know that it only aired 1 time and that it had to air after 8 o'clock so that kids weren't watching. Kids would be getting ready for bed, going to sleep. This was seen as very much something that was not safe for kids to watch. To get his Great Society programs passed through Congress, Johnson is going to rely on something called the Johnson treatment. Johnson's been in Congress most of his adult life. He was the Senate Majority Leader before he became Vice President. And one thing that Johnson's always sort of prided himself on is that he knows where all the bodies are buried. So that time that dead people voted for you or that time that you cheated on your wife, Johnson knows about that. And he doesn't necessarily blackmail people, but he would remind you what he knew. This is another great example of the Johnson treatment. You can see how close he's getting to people. Since a big man, he's over 6 feet tall, he knows that he can be an intimidating presence by calling in favors, by not quite exactly blackmailing people, and through use of the Johnson treatment, Johnson's going to get a lot passed through Congress. So we're going to start with beautification. Johnson's wife, Claudia, most often known as Lady Bird, is the person that's going to push for beautification with him quite heavily. And so some of this is seen as Lady Bird's arm of the Great Society. The first act that's going to pass as part of beautification is the Highway Beautification Act. That's sometimes called Lady Bird's Bill. This is meant to keep our highways clean, to keep the number of billboards down. There's a Texas component to this. So our state legislature is going to pass a companion bill that says that we don't mow down the wildflowers on the side of a Texas highway. That goes hand in hand with this beautification that we're seeing through Johnson. The Committee for a More Beautiful Capital Point is designed to make Washington, D.C. cleaner, prettier. If you think about D.C., we're competing with London and Paris. We don't really compare to those cities. So this is trying to get more green spaces and just a cleaner overall view of Washington, D.C. Johnson's also going to establish Reyes National Park and the Redwood National Park. And he's going to give us our first true environmental act, with the Prevention and Abatement of Air Pollution. That's usually just called the Clean Air Act. In this cartoon, what you're seeing here is Lady Bird Johnson giving Johnson the Johnson treatment. Civil rights is going to be the area that Johnson most heavily wants to push for. His first night in the White House, he calls his advisors, his closest friends, his aides together, and he says, "I'm never going to be more popular than I am right now. What should I push for?" And basically all of his aides tell him that the worst idea would be to push for civil rights. Johnson's a Democrat from the South. If he pushes for civil rights, he's going to drive part of his own party away. This is a little colorful, so I'm sorry for that. But Johnson says, well, if I can't do what I want, what the hell is the point of being president? So Johnson's immediately going to start pushing for civil rights. In this picture, we have Johnson and we have Martin Luther King Jr. Ultimately, these two men want the same thing, but they don't trust each other, and that's understandable. From Martin Luther King's point of view, Johnson's a good old boy from the South. He's a Texas senator. Why would Johnson care about anything in civil rights? What King doesn't know is that Johnson has actually been really supportive of civil rights for most of his life, but because he's from Texas and because he's an elected figure in Texas, he's had to keep that somewhat hidden. From Johnson's point of view, King is a preacher, and Johnson thinks that preachers should behave a certain way in their personal lives. The FBI has been bugging Martin Luther King's rooms for a while. When Johnson becomes president, he's given those tapes, and he finds out that not only is King smoking and drinking, he's also having several affairs. And it's not that Johnson hasn't done all of those same things in his life. It's just that Johnson thinks if you're a preacher, you're supposed to live a little differently. Their relationship is one that's very frustrating to study about because, again, both men want the same things. And if they could have trusted each other, they would have gotten there faster. But that's not what we're going to see happen. We do get some very important pieces of civil rights under Johnson. So in 1964, we're going to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1965, we get the Voting Act. And in 1964, we're also going to have the Immigration Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to outlaw discrimination based on race, color, ethnicity. The way that that is written is intentional, race, color, ethnicity, because Johnson knows that the South can be sneaky. He imagines a world when somebody can say, well, I'm not discriminating you based on your race, I'm discriminating you based on your color. So race, color, ethnicity. To prevent it from being passed, there is a senator who tacks on gender. So as the Civil Rights Act is written in 1964, it protects you based on race, color, ethnicity, and gender. When that senator added on gender, he thought, okay, this is going to for sure fail. But then another senator pointed out, well, now if I vote against it, I'm saying that I want African American men in the South to have more rights than my wife. And that's not something I can vote for. So sort of by accident, gender is going to get included in that. Johnson knows that, again, the South can be a little bit sneaky and that just passing a Civil Rights Act is not enough. And again, 64 is a voting year, so this is on his mind a lot, but he knows that there also needs to be protection for voting rights. He has used a lot of his political capital to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, so he's going to hold off and he waits for the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And essentially what he's waiting for is a big moment in the civil rights movement where the public is going to be intentionally on the side of the protesters. And that's going to come with the March on Selma. This is a march led by Dr. Martin Luther King, and it's a children's march. So not little kids, but if you had a 9, 10, 11-year-old, you might have brought them on this march with you. And the police are absolutely brutal in attacking the marchers. You can watch videos of policemen on horses attacking protesters, police beating protesters with a baton. This is, again, a very, very brutal response to a peaceful protest. It's so brutal that people are going to be on the side of the protesters. And Johnson's able to use that to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 removes all barriers to voting. So it takes away anything like the good character test or the poll tax or the grandfather clause. All of that is outlawed in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Some historians don't throw the Immigration Act in here for civil rights, but I think it does count as civil rights. The Immigration Act of 1964 is our first major overhaul of our immigration standards since World War II. So this act does two important things. At first, it creates a refugee status. During World War II, Lyndon Johnson is absolutely appalled at our government that we are not accepting Jewish refugees into this country. He does everything in his personal power to help them. Once he's president, he's going to expand that, and we're going to see this new creation of a refugee status in our immigration laws. So if you're fleeing persecution or possible death, we now have a way to enter you in this country. The second important thing this act does is that it creates the status of a war bride. So by this point, we've had World War II, and we've had the Korean War, and we're in the middle of Vietnam. We've had servicemen who have gone to fight overseas, met somebody there, gotten married, maybe even had children, and then when it's time for them to come home, they have a hard time bringing that family back home with them. So the creation of something called a war bride is going to allow servicemen to bring home their wives if they've met them during a time of war. The next major part of the Great Society is going to be the war on poverty. Johnson comes from a fairly poor family. He's the first person in his family to attend college. He puts his sibling through college, and his first job coming out of college is that he's a teacher. He talks a lot about his first teaching job. He was teaching down on the border, and he talked about how students would come to school and they would eat even the peel of the oranges they had because they had no other food. And he said it was impossible to teach them because they were starving. So always in his political life, Johnson has kind of kept that idea front and center, that the way that you can help most Americans is by moving them into the middle class. The war on poverty is designed to move people from poverty to the middle class. So the first thing we're going to have is the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. This is usually just called the Job Corps. If your job is being replaced by machines or it's becoming obsolete, the Job Corps retrains you for a job that is economically viable at that time. We're also going to see Head Start, which is a pre-K program. Since now we have 40 years of data from Head Start, we know children that go into Head Start are more likely to graduate high school, they're more likely to go and finish college, and they're less likely to be in prison. However, it's a fairly expensive program, and so when we start cutting back on the war on poverty, that's one of the first things that gets cut. Community action agencies are the federal government giving money to your local town, and then your town deciding how best to spend that. That is a great idea. Dallas probably knows what you need more than Washington, D.C. knows what you need. The problem is that there is not a lot of oversight of the CAAs, and we end up with a lot of fraud. So again, that's going to be a program that's cut fairly quickly. And Johnson's also going to create HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. What you're seeing here in this picture is Johnson playing the Congress like a piano. And again, the reason he's able to do that is because he knows where all the bodies are buried, he knows everybody's secrets, and everybody owes him a favor. So when he's trying to get these things passed, he gets them passed. For most people, Johnson sees education as the ticket to the middle class. So this is something that he really is going to focus on. Johnson's going to create the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That's going to put, for the first time ever, federal money into public schools. So before the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the state of Texas only funded Texas schools. So if you think about a state like Texas that's very big, we maybe can't spend as much per child as a state like Rhode Island or Connecticut. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act is going to be used to make it an even playing field. It's federal money designed so that second grade in Texas looks like second grade in Connecticut. Just like when we talked about with Eisenhower and the federal highway defense system, there ends up being some unintended consequences here. So if you took the TOS test or the STAR test or the TAX test, that's an unintended consequence of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. If your school is underperforming consistently, the federal government can pull their funding from that school. Also, if your school refused to integrate. Also, if your school is discriminating against any certain type of students, they can pull that funding. So it becomes a way for the federal government to really intervene and involve itself in public education. Johnson's also going to create the Higher Education Act, which is essentially something that looks like Teach for America. And he creates Pell Grants. So if you are in college on a Pell Grant, I went to college on a Pell Grant, you have Johnson to thank for that. He's going to create the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. These are federal programs designed to not only preserve American culture and history and art, but then to also share them. The last thing we're going to talk about in education is that Johnson creates the National School Lunch Act. Again, from his days as a teacher, Johnson thinks that you can't learn if you're starving. Out of all of Johnson's programs, this is probably the one that has expanded the most, because now not only do we have National School Lunch, we also have breakfast. All right, finally, under healthcare, what Johnson originally is going to push for is universal healthcare for all Americans. What he has to settle for is Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare and Medicaid are going to be healthcare for the elderly and for families with dependent children. Those are two groups that he views as being the most in need of healthcare. But I do want you to know that that was not his intention. His original intention was for everyone to get healthcare. So if we were going to base our evaluation of Johnson only off of the Great Society and what he was able to accomplish, we would probably say that he's a fairly productive president, more productive than most. But when Johnson leaves office, he is ranked at the bottom of all presidents, and the reason for that is going to be Vietnam. This is a picture taken right after a meeting with his generals describing the state of Vietnam. And I'm showing this picture to you because I think you can really see a lot here in his body language. This is a man who is frustrated, who is angry, who is a little bit defeated in approaching this war. Johnson at one point is going to say to his aides, and again, this is colorful, so I'm sorry, that the Great Society is this beautiful woman that he loves and he can't stop thinking about. He just wants to spend all of his time with her. And then Vietnam is this bitch that won't get out of the way. He also at one point says to one of his aides that all countries are like Mexico. They just want to be America. That's not a great understanding of Mexico. That's a terrible understanding of Vietnam. So Vietnam does really become the thing in Johnson's presidency that he just can't defeat. Johnson wants to be a domestic policy president. The same way that Eisenhower saw himself as a foreign policy president, Johnson sees himself as all about domestic policy. But with this war going on, there's nothing he can do to avoid it. As the war goes on, as it heats up, the protests become much, much more personal. Protesters used to stand outside the White House all hours of the day and night, and they had this chant, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today?" And they would say that over and over and over. Johnson stops eating, he stops sleeping, and this is the man that's designing our war policy. By 1968, Johnson's popularity is falling, and then Robert Kennedy announces that he intends to run for the Democratic nomination. Being John F. Kennedy's little brother, Robert Kennedy is going to get a lot of sympathy vote. That already has Johnson concerned. Then in April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot and killed. He's assassinated. So we have Bobby Kennedy running, we have the war not going well in Vietnam, we have Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated, and it just seems like everything is falling apart. So in 1968, he announces that he does not intend to run for the presidency. He's stepping out. And he says he's going to use the rest of his time as president to work on getting us out of the war. Twice during the last few months of 68, we have North Vietnam just about ready to sign a negotiation with us, just about ready to end the war, and then they back out. Twice that happens. And at the time, we can't figure it out. Why did they get so close to agreeing to a deal and then back out? What we now know is that Johnson's talking to North Vietnam, and at the same time, so is Nixon. In 1968, Nixon is running for president for the Republicans. And so Nixon says to the North Vietnamese, if you can wait 5 months, if you can wait 3 months, I'll give you a better deal. So Nixon's going to undercut our efforts to end the Vietnam War. After 1968, Johnson is going to leave public life. He's incredibly unpopular. It's to the point where other politicians will not take their pictures with him. They will not shake his hand. Nobody wants to be seen in public with him. Johnson's going to end up having a heart attack and he dies. Johnson dies in 1973, right before the end of the Vietnam War. So he doesn't live to see that concluded. And he also doesn't live to see his reputation rise. What's been happening in the last 10 or 15 years is that the Johnson, the Nixon, and the Kennedy archives have started to open. A lot of the things that we originally gave Kennedy credit for, things like the war on poverty and things like civil rights, as the archives have opened, what we found is it actually wasn't Kennedy, it was Johnson who did those things. When Johnson was trying to get those things passed, he would always say, you have to vote for this because this is what the dead president would want you to do. Nobody wants to be the jerk in Congress voting against the guy that just got shot, so they go along with it. But we now know that those weren't Kennedy plans, they were Johnson plans. So as Kennedy's reputation has gone down, Johnson's reputation is coming up. If you were to take this class again in 10 or 15 years, my bet is going to be that Kennedy's reputation is going to be lower, probably less than half. Kennedy will be ranked in the bottom half of presidents, and Johnson, by that time, will be ranked in probably the top 20% of presidents. Since his death, he's been given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Reagan for his work in civil rights. And then George W. Bush renamed our Department of Education the LBJ Department of Education. Both of those honors have come from Republican presidents, so it's a really interesting divide there. Even though Johnson's reputation is being rehabilitated and even though his ranking as a president is going up, Democrats still don't like to associate themselves with him. They still see him as too toxic to take on his legacy. All right, so that gets us through Johnson and Kennedy. And then next week we will start civil rights.